Now, from Darwin's Evolutions Publishing, Hellforge, a short story by Darwin A. Garrison, narrated by Lord Rexworth. Marsh waited with his back against a scorched sandstone boulder. His cloak shielded him from the noonday sun, but his nose still wrinkled when the scent of brimstone wafted by with every breeze. He cursed the heat of the day, the brimstone, and the delay, but he had no choice. He had to deal with his pursuer now, in a place of his choosing. A scrabbling in the loose rock on the trail behind the boulder brought him back from his reverie. He held his breath, and waited to see what would enter the pass. A figure moved from shadow into light, and Marsh's eyes narrowed as he estimated the threat. Could this filthy, shambling wreck possibly be the child he had first seen following him from the ruins of Dunfeld 3 days ago, or was it some spawn of the forge sent to hunt him? He kept still, confident in the enchantment of his cloak. The figure lowered itself to the ground and examined the trail carefully, its ragged clothing flopping forward as it bent down. A portion of the creature's back was bared, revealing fair skin, the welts of burns, and the ridges of its spine. Then it collapsed on the trail and sobbed. "Gone! He's gone!" came the choked girl's voice from the huddled pile of rags. The sobs continued for a handful of seconds before a coughing fit set in. Marsh lowered his hood and cleared his throat. Not gone. Waiting. The girl flipped over in shock and tried to scrabble back from him like a crab. Before she could clear his reach, though, Marsh had snagged her by the tunic. "Peace!" he commanded as she twisted madly against his grip. Her mouth gaped wide. "Don't! Bite me and I'll cuff you till you see stars!" The tone of his last threat apparently reached the girl. She paused in her struggles and actually looked at him for the first time. When Marsh released her tunic, she wrapped herself round his right boot and began to sob anew. "Sir Knight, forgive me! Mercy!" Marsh knelt down and pried her away from his foot. "Stop that," he chided her in a soft voice. "There is nothing to forgive. Let's have a look at you." He lifted her chin, and in so doing he could see that she had suffered much. To his surprise, he found the girl was no child, but a young teen. The left side of her face was burned, blistered, and raw, the eye blackened from some blow or fall. Pus oozed from several cuts on her chin and neck. Her tears had cut tracks through the dirt and dust that caked her face. Truth be told, she looked as though she had been buried and resurrected, with clumps of loam and leaf hiding her long hair. A quick but gentle check of her arms and legs showed many other burns and cuts, and her bare feet were a maze of filthy lacerations. "We must attend to your wounds, else you'll soon be very sick," Marsh pronounced finally. He looked up at the girl, catching her brown eyes in his gaze. "Name yourself." "Emmeline," she replied, and then ducked her head. "My lord, you're going to Helmont to kill the Dark Lady, aren't you?" Marsh reached for his pack. "None of that my lord business or talk of the Dark Lady," he said as he untied his canteen. "She is dead some 500 years past." He uncorked the wooden drum and handed it to Emmeline, who took it with hesitant fingers. After a nod from Marsh, she upended the tiny cask and drank. Several loud gulps later, she lowered the canteen and looked at him with an embarrassed expression. "Many thanks, lord," she said as she returned the canteen. "I said leave off with that lord talk," Marsh grumbled as he snatched the cask back and returned it to his pack. "No man, woman, or child bends a knee to me." "But I saw the imperial griffin upon your surcoat and shield when you passed through the village. None but the nobles may bear that heraldry. That's when I knew you rode on the forge of Helmont." "Fine. I'll admit my goal is Helmont, but I suffer the imperial coat of arms grudgingly." He sat back on his heels and measured her with a long look. "So you watched me as I passed through those ruins, eh? Why did you not call out to me then?" I was afraid you were a seeming sent by the succubi to tempt me into the open." Her voice dropped to a guarded whisper. "They cast visions as they hunt." Marsh grunted and then turned to bind up his pack. "True, but visions make no sound. Could you not hear my horse's footfalls or the clatter of my gear?" "No, sire," Emmeline said with a shake of her head. "Until yesterday I could hear little. The roar of the skyfire stole it from me for several days. I had no choice but to be suspicious that my heart was filling my head with wish sound." "So how have you avoided them on the trail?" "I buried myself each night in the dirt between the crags, covering my face with pine boughs." Ah, said Marsh, with raised eyebrows and a nod of agreement. Clever, and more wisdom than I'd expect from one so young. He loosened the pack straps. How old are you, by the by? 15 this coming fall, sire. She eyed him doubtfully as he rose with the pack and came near her. My name is Marsh. Use it. He lifted the pack and began guiding her arms through the straps. Yes, Marsh, she said as she looked at him with a confused expression. Marsh tightened the shoulder straps, which caused her to grimace in pain as they pulled against her burns and cuts. Once the straps were settled, he reached back into the pack, pulled a bit of jerky out, and handed it to Emmeline. Am I to bear your pack, Marsh? The question was not one of offence. He could tell she just wanted to know what her duties were to be. You carry the pack and I will carry you, he said as he took her hand and bade her rise. It's easier than carrying you on top of the pack. I know of a small grotto not far up the trail from here. We can pause there to clean your wounds and rest. I'm sorry about your horse, she muttered as he turned round. He was beautiful. You must miss him. Marsh sighed. He served the Empire well, as do I, whether I wish to or not. He bent his legs and encouraged the girl onto his back. After settling her into position, he began walking down the trail. Frankly, I fear that I'll soon be missing my shield more than the horse. The small campfire crackled against the night, providing just enough light for Marsh to work. He poured the grease from the roasted rabbit through a square of cheesecloth into a small mortar. Emmeline watched from where she sat on his blanket next to a tiny stream, the remains of a meal in a small tin plate by her left hand. He gathered up the herbs he had collected from the crags and crevices surrounding the grotto and began mixing them with the hot fat. I never knew there were so many things to eat around here, Emmeline said as he ground the mixture with his pestle. Those little cactus fruits were so tangy and sweet. They were a favourite of the nomads. This was their kingdom long ago. He crushed some fragrant leaves and drizzled them in the mixture. Were they as frightful as the legends say? Her tone made him smile. The child in her still sought tales to brighten a starry night, despite all that had happened. He sat back from the fire while continuing to grind the mixture, and looked at her without losing his smile. Indeed they were. They painted their bodies in blue and red dyes, and clothed themselves in colourful feathers. The weapons they wielded were made of obsidian and bone, not steel. Yet they would charge a seasoned pike line without fear, while their arrows rained from the sky. For all their ferocity in battle, however, they were kind and loving in peace, gentle hosts with an ear for poetry and music, and their women told stories as old as time with magical dances that anyone could understand. I'd never heard that, Emmeline said with wide eyes. More's the pity, Marsh said with a sigh. He poured the mixture into another bit of cheesecloth and squeezed a green jelly through it onto a broad leaf. Let's have a look at your wounds now. When they had arrived earlier, he had carefully washed her from head to toe, excepting the more private areas that he had allowed her to clean alone. Like all wounded, once she had been clean, her injuries had appeared far less gruesome. Marsh was especially grateful that despite all the recent tragedy, she still had the ability to share shy smiles and gentle laughter at times. Regardless, several of the wounds had been infected, and her feet were a sore and miserable mess. He had confined her to the blanket until he could treat that damage. This will sting a little, but that will fade quickly. Don't scratch it, he warned her. Yes, Marsh. He proceeded to apply the ointment to her burns and cuts, giving particular attention to the infected ones. Emmeline flinched several times, but never cried out. You're a good patient, he said, as he finished with her arms and moved to her legs. She had collected several gouges there, but none had been obviously infected. I have 4 older brothers. I guess. Marsh glanced up at her, but she had looked away from the fire. A glimmer of light twinkled on her lashes. So you learned to hold your own, eh? He said softly as he finished on the last laceration and moved down to her feet. Emmeline scrubbed at her eyes with the back of her left hand and sniffed loudly before turning back to him with a bittersweet smile. Yes, that's right. I've had plenty of cuts and scrapes over the years. My brothers loved to tease me about crying out when Mamma would treat them, so I learned to make myself be quiet as she worked, no matter how much it hurt. Marsh chuckled. Not so different than my own times as a squire, then. Heaven help you if the older boys found a chink in your armour. Emmeline flexed her arms, her eyes wide with surprise. Hey, all the achy feeling's going away. That's the darso. The juice from the stems numbs cuts and burns. How long will it last? Overnight, Marsh said. He finished applying the salve to her feet and laid the leaf aside. He got up and went back to the fire. Using his dagger, he fished a fine skein of thread and a needle from a pot of boiling water, and then returned to Emeline's side. Most importantly, though, it'll numb you up enough for me to stitch the worst of the cuts closed. Think you can still be a good patient? The girl nodded once, but her jaw was set. Marsh smiled softly. Good. Sooner started, sooner done. True to her word, Emeline held very still as he carefully stitched up the worst of the gashes in her feet, legs, and arms. There was little he could do about the small cuts, but the gentle earth magic in the salve would help those more than his meagre efforts with needle and thread. When he had finished, he applied extra salve over the top of his stitches. Here, he lifted her feet. Let me put the pack under your legs so your feet don't touch the blanket. I've got to finish your slippers for you. Slippers? She asked with a tilt of her head. What kind of slippers? Marsh returned to the fire where he had stretched the rabbit skins over some rocks and laid out his meagre supply of deer leather. Doe skin with rabbit pelt liners. Oh, I love the feel of rabbit fur. Well, he said with a chuckle, you won't be getting that feel. You're getting the uncured side against those feet of yours, along with a thick coat of salve. What? For heaven's sake, why? Moisture, he replied as he used an awl to punch holes along the edge of the doe skin that he had cut to shape while dinner had been cooking. It'll help the salve do its job and cushion your feet. He produced a larger needle from a small pouch, along with a thin rawhide thread, and began stitching the pieces together. You'll wear the skins like socks. Emeline made a disgusted expression, but held her tongue. Silence stretched out for several minutes as the fire crackled. Marsh? How do you avoid the succubi? Marsh looked up into the darkness beyond the fire for a moment before answering. I don't. They avoid me. But why? Because they have no power over me is the easiest answer. I'm not walking this path in error, Emeline. Neither are you. I don't... She started, her voice full of doubt. You're not supposed to, he answered before she could finish. For now, the only thing you need to understand is that you can sleep tonight without fear. He looked up at the stars and then back down to her with a smile. Have you heard of the legend of how Halla Firemane won her circlet of stars? When Emeline shook her head, they began the tale, stitching her slippers while he talked. The greater moon Ethana was setting and the lesser moon Bergat rising when the she-were came to call on the camp. Marsh watched from inside his cloak as the puma guided down the slope of the far rock face, dodging with unconscious grace the veriest scrub and rubble that would have given her away. She paused in the shadows, tail twitching. Marsh could almost feel the struggle between her rational thought and animal instinct when facing the campfire. The human side remained stronger on this night, however, as she gave her head a shake and paced fully into the pale red glow. The great cat then stretched out alongside the fire and began to groom herself with her broad pink tongue. You're late, Marsh commented as though noting the colour of a leaf. The puma's head came up, looking left and right as if confused. Then her eyes focused where he sat. A twist of light and a shimmer of change left a naked woman lying beside the fire where the puma had just been. Her hair was tawny and her skin sun-browned, but her eyes remained golden in the firelight, along with broad vertical slits for pupils. And you are no longer alone, she replied with a silken voice that purred in the dark. She sleeps. The Darso lends rest as it heals. The she-were tilted her head. But why bring a woman-child into your orbit of death? Surely not to warm your bed. She is the witness. I'm sure of it. The she-were grinned at him sardonically. Adding oracle to your list of accomplishments now? No more than you add concubine to yours. His attempt at verbal riposte brought only laughter. If only you knew how we mate, Marsh, you would laugh as well. She crawled toward him, her breasts swaying seductively. I could show you if you like. What moves in the night, Samat? His cold tone brought a wry grin to the she-were's lips. She rolled over onto her back and crossed her legs in the most revealing way possible. What a pity, she said airily. Oh, I came across a pair of succubi moving along the trail. Those I dispatched, the foul-tasting things. A lesser demon passed by as well, but he apparently had another errand in mind. I let it pass. The hob? If they move tonight, it is not in these rocks. I dare say you'll see them soon enough. As always, Marsh? Remember your place, Samat. His tone was light and conversational, but the threat loomed large. If it fazed the she-were, however, she showed it not at all. Samat rolled on her side and favoured him with a pout. To think I would find myself bound to such a man. Why, you have not shared your bed with me in over a fortnight. I shall pine away if you do not show me some attention. Your binding to me is a transient thing, unlike the one that ties me to my fate. Be grateful for it. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Still, your needs do not fall on deaf ears. You are welcome to share my cloak with me until dawn comes. He held the garment open, and Samat slipped into its recesses and wrapped herself round him, and for a while Marsh could leave the past behind. By the time Amelin stirred, Samat had been gone for an hour. Marsh shook off the faint feeling of emptiness that always lingered after his dalliances with the she-were, and turned his attention to morning chores. Any worries about the condition of the girl's feet evaporated as she got up and tottered off behind some scrub without a grimace or moan. He was well into cooking their morning porridge when she sat down across from him, her mouth agape in surprise. "What?" he asked after glancing up from studying for a moment. The girl held out her arms so that he could see them. The burns had faded to leave the skin red-tinged, but healthy-looking, with no trace of scarring. The cuts were mostly closed, and pale white, except for a few of the deeper ones that still held a tinge of purple-red. Her face was completely clear. "Ah, good," he said as he went back to his studying. "Any pain?" Amelin shook her head. "No, except for a little in my feet. How is this possible? Any one of these should have taken 2 weeks or more to heal properly, and that's ignoring the ones that flowed pus." Marsh lifted the pot from the fire without comment and spooned pottage into the tin plate that Amelin had used the night before. "I'm guessing," he said as he handed her the portion and a wooden spoon, "that your Hamlet didn't have a mage. Is that right?" Amelin shook her head as she took her breakfast. "We weren't big enough yet to attract one." Marsh grunted as he used the mixing spoon to eat from the pot. "Well," he continued after a few bites, "it's no surprise you haven't seen Darso's salve before, then. Takes some training to harvest it properly." "Is it magic?" the girl asked with wide eyes. "Of a sort. Herbals, mostly, with a touch of earth magic. I can teach you if you like. It's not hard." "I'd like that, Marsh," she agreed with a nod. The rest of her breakfast passed in companionable silence. When they had finished, Marsh began cleaning and packing his gear. While he scrubbed the dishes in the stream, Amelin walked up beside him. "You're going to leave me, aren't you?" He could hear a dark terror lurking in her soft question. He shook his head. "No, but I won't force you to go either. I could arrange safe passage for you to the border if you choose." He glanced up to see her shaking her head this time. "I couldn't go back. Not now. I have to see." Marsh rocked back on his heels and looked up at her. "Have to see what? The forge is not exactly scenic." "Not the forge. I just know that I have to be there. I have to be with you." Her voice rose as she spoke, becoming almost shrill with the intensity of need. "Calm down, Amelin," he soothed. He stood and shook the water from his gear. "I'll not hinder you. Like I said last night, we're both walking this path for a reason. That's just the way fate works sometimes." He dipped the pot in the stream and walked back to the fire to douse it. The girl followed close behind. "You realize," he continued as he stirred the ashen slurry with the toe of his boot, "there's bound to be trouble as we near the forge." "Yes," she answered in a small, tight voice. "Can you handle a spear?" he asked as he turned to stow the gear in his pack and rolled the blankets. "Make it about as long as a pitchfork and I'll be fine." "Fair enough." Fabricating Amelin's weapon delayed their departure until mid-morning. A downed yew tree provided a suitable shaft, and Marsh supplied a spare dagger stripped of its grips for the head. The last of the rawhide went to binding the shaft and head together, along with a raptor feather of some kind that the girl found in the crags. Before leaving the grotto, Marsh checked her feet one last time. The Darso salve had done as well there as it had done for her face, and he was able to discard the rabbit pelts in favor of binding her feet with strips of cheesecloth. "I'll take the stitches out tonight," he announced as he handed her the slippers. Amelin gave him a curt nod. "Time to go?" she asked as she used her spear to lever herself up. Marsh regarded her for a moment and then nodded slightly before shouldering his pack and heading down the path out of the grotto. As they walked out of the cut that led to the grotto, the overwhelming odor of brimstone assailed Marsh again. The demon scent tainted everything between the forge and the desert side of the mountains. Of all the foul odors in the world, he hated none so much as brimstone, not for the smell itself, but rather for the memories that churned his stomach as he walked. They spoke few words until Marsh paused in the lee of a ridge for lunch. He divvied up a portion of his jerky, and they passed the canteen back and forth as they ate. "Marsh," the girl asked as her small meal waned toward completion. "Do you know why?" "Why what, girl?" "Why this?" She waved her hand at the rocks that surrounded them. Scorch marks from the sky fire were everywhere, mostly clustered near the upper reaches, but no one place was completely untouched. Marsh grunted and tossed his last bit of jerky into his mouth. "Just the sky fire. Or do you want to know why the forge has reawakened after all these years?" Amelin looked back into his eyes as if trying to read his intent, and then shrugged. "Both, I guess." "All right," Marsh said, and scooted back into the shade so that he could lean against a rock. "Let's start with the sky fire." The girl scooted close, bringing the canteen with her. "First off," he began, "I'm no kind of mage. I picked up a bit here and there, like anyone with an interest, but I'm not an expert. Do I make myself clear?" Amelin nodded. "Good. Now, you know of the Dark Lady, so you know the legend of the Forge's creation, right?" This brought another nod, and Marsh grinned. "Well, this won't be such a chore after all. When the Dark Lady was ready to bring the Forge out of the Helmont, she knew that her incantations would leave her weak and defenseless for a time. She also knew that anyone with even a smattering of magecraft would be on her like tar on a roof. No sane practitioner would ever dare build a gate to the underworld." "So the Dark Lady was mad?" "Oh, yes," Marsh allowed as he stroked his short beard. For a moment, the memories rose up thick and distracting, but he forced them back. Yes, out of her head, because of the events in her life that led her to raise the forge, but that's a different tale." He cleared his throat and motioned for the canteen. Amelin handed to him, and he used the excuse of taking a drink to order his thoughts. "Anyway," he said while he plugged the canteen, "mad as she was, she realized that she'd be defenseless against anyone for a time, so she added a few careful bits to her incantations and made sure that no one within 2 days' hard ride was alive to bother her. Indeed. The desert of Gilmoroth was once a fertile plain, and the Janfar nomads roamed there far more often than in the mountains. The forge brought death to both." Amelin's head went to her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. Marsh sighed. "I told you she was mad, without compassion or conscience. It was a perfectly logical thing for her to do. She created the sky fire from the magical elements of Helmont. Fire without fuel, burning until dawn. As a weapon, it's pure genius, though mad beyond redemption." "And the succubi and imps?" Amelin managed to ask from behind her hand. "Naturally drawn through the open hell gate toward human suffering. She had a reputation for elegant solutions where the minimum of magic achieved the maximum effect. That's why she didn't use any beyond the sky fire and summoning the hob." "Hob?" The girl's previous fright dissolved into confusion. Marsh held his hand out above the ground at what would normally be waist high. Little grey vermin about this high, shaped like skinny men, but strong beyond belief. They're an earth imp, I think. They carry these wicked little picks that can pierce armor with a well-placed blow. She worked a summons into her incantation, as a secondary line of defense apparently. Amelin eyed her spear suspiciously. "So you made that for me?" He nodded. "You'll want to keep them at arm's length. I have no doubt we'll be seeing them soon enough." "How can the forge burn again? You said the Dark Lady is 500 years dead." Marsh rubbed his face and stood, Amelin following after a moment's hesitation. "The lady is dead," he said in resignation, "but her madness did not die with her." They continued steadily down the mountain pass toward the desert the rest of the day. Along the way, Marsh had Amelin pick up certain stones and plants, explaining the relevance of each as they walked. The afternoon was waning before they crossed a small stream that trickled down a steep walled cut in the flank of the mountain. Within those damp and shady walls, he was finally able to find a Darso cactus for her to gather while he refilled their canteen. Make sure that the quartz is at the apex, he reminded her as water gurgled into the cask. It is the focus that binds the enchantment together, otherwise the spines will strike and you'll nap till morning. Yes, Marsh. He could hear the distraction in her voice as she concentrated on the task. There was a small pop, and she shrieked. Oops, sorry I forgot to warn you about that, he said with a chuckle as he rose from the stream. The girl was pressed back against the wall of the cut, with her hand over her heart. A small mage light danced merrily over her rune of sticks and rocks. You didn't say anything about blue flame, she gasped out at him. You got ahead of me. Besides, learning us to have some surprises or you'd get bored. Now, blow the mage light onto the cactus and take the one branch that loses its spines. The girl leaned forward, hesitated, and then gently blew the flame toward the plant. The mage light never wavered. Instead, it slid over as a whole until it encompassed the cactus. After several moments, the spines on the nearer branch shriveled and fell away, and the girl was able to reach in and pluck it. Excellent work, Emmeline, Marsh said with pride. Now wrap the branch in those leaves we picked. Marsh? Yes? If you're not a knight, how did you get involved? Marsh tied the canteen to his pack as Emmeline placed the wrapped Darso branch into the pouch she had fashioned from the remnants of her cloak. I'm a wanderer, girl, he said as he shouldered his pack and adjusted the weight on his back. As for this journey we're shedding, how am I to understand how fate, craftings, and magic move the world? One day I walked into Grimmauld and felt the need to speak a few words to the Emperor. So I attended a public audience and had my say. The next thing I knew, I was wedding the Empire's finest and riding a great horse out the city gates toward the forge. Emmeline retrieved her spear and leaned on it, watching him intently. What were the words? Well, he said with a sniff, I don't really remember them too clearly. Something about the forge awakened and the dark lady in torment. I've always had these odd thoughts, memories that can't be mine. Lately they've been getting stronger and more intense. I'm not really sure what it all means, but I certainly scared the royal crap out of the Emperor. Magic? Emmeline's eyes were bright with wonder. Marsh grunted as he began walking out of the cut. Yes, magic, he muttered, of the worst possible kind. The hob attacked as they staggered out onto the trail. One moment the afternoon sun was warming Marsh's face as he helped Emmeline out of the cut. The next two groups of howling grey figures charged them from either side of the trail. Back up! He roared as he drew his sword. He heard the girl scrabbling backward as the first of the hob reached him. Memories of battles he had never fought flowed into him as he gutted the first imp and then turned the blow sideways to parry a pick strike from another. The parry turned into a low spin that cleft several knees in the growing rank of hob, giving him enough time to scurry back to join Emmeline. Her spear flashed past him to stab an imp that had leapt into the cut with Marsh. The creature screeched with outrage as the razor edge of the enchanted dagger disemboweled it. Its noisy death gave Marsh his chance to get his stance back, and its entrails made the footing far more treacherous for their foes. The cut was so narrow at the trail end that only 3 or 4 of the creatures could squeeze in at a time, but that did not deter them. Marsh and Emmeline had the advantage of reach over any of the imps, but the hob continued to hurl themselves past the growing mound of their dead and dying, even as Marsh's arm began to ache with unaccustomed use. A ragged pick flashed in the sun, and he felt the point rend his breastplate. Pain flared in his chest as Emmeline's spear jabbed out again. The creature fell backward, its throat slashed halfway through. Marsh reached up and wrenched the pick out of his armour. He could feel the blood flowing freely under his padding as he continued to parry and slash with both the pick and his sword. A creeping inevitability settled over him. There were simply too many hob to kill before his arm failed. He and Emmeline were going to die. Magic be damned. A feline roar sounded outside of the cut. Marsh took a swing at the nearest hob and then glanced up in time to see one of its compatriots flying past the opening to the trail, spraying purple blood all the way. The imps in the cut hesitated. The sword whistled as Marsh slashed forward. The opportunity would not come again, the numbness in his grip notwithstanding. Amelin's spear stabbed out beside him, and the remaining hob broke and ran for the light as their front rank crumbled. The light on the trail betrayed them, however, for Samat had already dispatched their comrades, and now awaited the survivors fleeing from the cut. In a few short minutes, between the she-ware's claws, sword and spear, none of the hob remained alive. Marsh staggered over to the edge of the trail and collapsed with his back against the living stone of the mountain. Sweat poured down his face as he panted and tried to ignore the pain from his left shoulder. The late afternoon sun that had felt so pleasant earlier now beat down mercilessly on the living and the dead alike. The twin stenches of battle and brimstone combined to curdle his stomach. Amelin wandered into view, her eyes wide and face pale, as she witnessed the carnage she had helped to wreak. She sank to her knees before bending sideways to retch. "For the love of the fair one's tits, Marsh," snarled Samat, "why can't you ever be hunted by something that tastes good?" Hob blood covered her mouth, hands, feet, and torso. She spat to the side and then turned on Amelin. "Stupid woman-child! If you're going to heave your lunch, do it downwind. I'll be smelling that filth for hours now." "Amelin," wheezed Marsh as he made half-hearted gestures with his right hand. "I don't believe you've met Samat." The girl rolled onto her side and peered owlishly at the she-were, who looked down on Amelin with disdain. After several seconds of careful observation, the girl finally managed to speak. "You're naked." Samat rolled her eyes. "Oh, yes, Marsh, she's definitely the most observant human I've ever met. How could I have doubted you?" She stepped over to him and wrestled the canteen free of its ties. With a twist of her wrist, she pried the cork out and began doing her best to rinse off the hob blood. Marsh finally managed to loosen his fingers from the hilt, and the sword clattered onto the rocky trail. He tried to loosen the straps of his pack and breastplate, but his fingers refused to cooperate. A scrabbling on the stone trail announced Amelin struggling onto her knees to try and help. "You're hurt," she said. All emotion leached from her voice. She began working the clasps on the left side of his armor. Marsh let his hands drop. "I told you I'd be missing that shield more than the horse," he answered. Samat joined them, dropping the nearly empty canteen into his lap before kneeling down on the right to help. The smell of hob still lingered about her, but her natural musky scent overwhelmed the foulness. "Thank you, Samat," he murmured, feeling lightheaded. The she-were turned her emerald eyes on him, and then very gently licked his cheek. His vision narrowed into a sparkling tunnel that closed off to leave him drifting into unconsciousness. When Marsh awoke, he found himself in a cold camp, but a warm bedroll. A soft, purring breath tickled his ear, and he realized that Samat had curled up with him in the blankets. He turned his head away from her breath and saw a distant figure holding a feathered spear silhouetted against the canopy of stars. Careful flexing of his shoulder revealed a light pulling sensation and the scratchy feel of bandages rather than pain. Samat stirred against him. "She's not so bad," said a feline whisper in his ear, followed by a warm tongue. Marsh turned back to Samat, whose carnival grin sparkled in the starlight beneath her liquid black night eyes. "She made Darso's salve for you. The child learns quickly, although I admit you gave her something of a head start." The she-ware's hand caressed him under the blanket, carefully avoiding his shoulder. Her voice shifted from playful to serious. "Don't try that again, man. Your time with me is not yet done." "It's not like I was trying to get myself killed," he answered as his hands strayed to Samat's athletic body. He felt her pleased purr more than he heard it. "Of course not," she agreed as her hands slipped lower. "That comes later." Dawn broke the following morning, and Marsh found himself with company in his bedroll again. This time, though, Amelin's ragged snore filled his ear as a coarse, homespun shirt upbraided his bare arm. Of Samat there was no sign. He slipped carefully into the chill dawn air. The two had apparently carried him further down slope to the place he had intended to camp the night before. Only protected grottos and box canyons like this one survived the purge of the skyfire, so they became his natural waypoints. The canyon he and Amelin currently occupied had an additional notable feature, a grove of springstem clustered by a pool nestled beneath a rocky overhang. Marsh walked over to the neat pile of his gear that his companions had stacked and pulled his sword from its sheath. The gleam of the morning sun along the oiled steel brought a smile to his lips. He had no doubt that Amelin had been the one to clean his blade. Samat cared little for any metal. With the smile still lingering on his lips, he made his way down to the spring stem and began harvesting the water that would see them across the desert. Marsh could not help chuckling when he looked back over his shoulder. The absurdity of his bizarre little caravan crossing the Gilmaroth flats tickled his fancy. Samat had joined up with them at the foot of the mountains at the very edge of the desert. The tense posture of the she-were in her puma form spoke volumes of her distaste for the burnt earth and sand that awaited them. Still, she had followed willingly as they marched into the blazing sun and swirling dust, shaking each paw for a moment as she lifted it off the burning ground. Providing a small measure of protection for Amelin had proven to be a bit more of a challenge. Her clothes were mostly tatters. In the end, Marsh had arranged the massive spring stem to overhang her head, something like a small roof. He thought the solution clever, even though it gave the girl the vague appearance of a tinker's wagon with legs. By the time they found a low gully large enough for them to set up a cold camp, however, his smile was gone. All three of them were tired to the bone and half-dried to jerky. Worse yet, the desert held none of its heat at all, and soon they were shivering in the gathering gloom. "Let me have a drink from the canteen, Marsh," demanded Samat. "I'm parched." "Me too," echoed Amelin. He glanced at both of them and then began digging in his pack. "What are you doing?" Samat growled. "Just give me the drum." "No," he said flatly as he pulled his mortar out. He carefully uncorked the flat keg and poured a measure out into the ceramic vessel. He served the she-were first, conscious of her prickly nature. "You're not going to let me drink my fill, are you?" she asked suspiciously. "Not from the keg, no." Samat's eyes widened as she looked at the stack of spring stem. "Oh, no," she said with a shake of her head. "You don't intend for us to start with that foul stuff, do you?" Marsh gave the she-were a grim smile, which sent her off into a frenzy of cursing that lasted for the better part of a quarter-hour. When she finished, she downed the cup of water, thrust it back at him, and then stalked over to the stack of spring stem. She selected the one with the largest diameter before marching off into the gathering dark, muttering obscenities to herself. Amelin's wide eyes practically glowed in the last colours of sunset as he handed over her nightly ration of free water. "I didn't know there were that many bad words in any language," she said in an awed voice. Marsh chuckled. "She collects them. We've been to a lot of different places over the years. For example, I lost track tonight when she shifted from Desagoth into that other one with the guttural R's." Amelin chose to drink her ration in sips rather than gulping it down as Samat had. "How long have you known her?" she asked in between drinks. He rolled his head on his shoulders before answering. "Since I was a toddler, and she a cub. Her clan and my family were bound somehow. My parents never said much more than that about it, and her clan isn't known for being what you'd call open. The end result is that she is bound to my service, though you'd never know it sometimes." The girl finished off her ration and handed the mortar back to Marsh. "Is she your wife?" From out in the darkness, a distant "Ha!" drifted back to the camp, setting off an attack of the giggles for both of them. "Samat considers it more of a convenient mating arrangement," he answered after their laughter subsided. "I don't think I measured up in some respects to the Toms of her clan." He gazed out into the darkness in the general direction of the she-were's last comment. "Still, we've been together for a long time, and she's never left my side for long. There's nothing I can't tell her, and I honestly could not imagine being without her. Maybe that's better than married in some ways." He chose not to mention the odd memories that so often surfaced when Samat came near, images of another woman that sometimes hardened his heart toward the she-were against his will. Amelin left off her questioning, and the silence stretched out as the darkness deepened. They chewed a half-length of spring stem each, and split a ration of jerky before turning in for the night. Because of the chill night air, they shared the blankets and their body warmth. When Samat returned around midnight, they gratefully added her feline form to the pile. Their trek across the desert took on the sameness after that first day. They marched by day across the fiery sands, only to set up their familiar cold camp in an inconvenient dip in the terrain at dusk. followed, of course, by the nightly ritual of chewing of spring stem and jerky until their jaws ached. On the fourth night, however, a red glow coloured the distant horizon long after sunset. The three stood side by side for a long time after dinner, watching it as it flickered, brightened, then darkened again. A distant rumble seemed to come through their feet in time with the changing intensity. "Is that—" began Emmeline. "The forge?" offered Marsh. "Yes. We'll be able to see Helmont as we walk tomorrow. Only one more camp after this for us. After that, it's time to see what madness has returned to the Dark Lady's home." Samat gave an uncharacteristic mew and slipped into Marsh's arms. After a while, Emmeline slipped up next to him and burrowed her fingers in his tunic. He freed his right arm to hold her as well. The next day's travel became a study in contrasts. They began in the bright morning sunshine, but by noon they had passed under a shelf of smoke or cloud that dimmed the day to near twilight levels. During their march, Samat moved steadily forward until she shook the lead in the afternoon, her ears pricked forward and her nose twitching constantly. The glow of the previous night returned when they passed under the cloud. Their progress soon showed a distant smoking spire that rose ever higher the closer they got. The rumbling now began to assail their ears as well as their feet, and the smell of brimstone became omnipresent. "Is Samat looking for Hob?" asked Emmeline during one of their infrequent breaks. Marsh shook his head. "No, the Hob left off at the mountains. Now that we are near the forge, Samat watches for Hellspawn. The Dark Lady's work gave them substance in this realm, and they ever longed for someone new to offer them the opportunity again." The girl looked round with worried eyes. "Don't worry," he said as he handed her a bit of spring stem. "Samat will sniff them out as they come." Emmeline took the moist stem and then looked at the black shaft that stabbed up from the horizon. "What is that, Marsh?" "That's the chimney of the forge. That's where we'll be, soon enough." As evening approached, the small band crested a low ridge, and the base of the Helmont came into view, spread wide beneath the unnatural spire of the chimney. Marsh could feel the thrum of tainted magic all around him. Near the bottom of the forge, he could just make out the glowing grotto that marked the entrance into the Dark Lady's creche. "We'll camp in the lee of this ridge for the night," he announced flatly. When the others made no move to leave the ridge, he reached out and touched each of them, guiding them back down the trail to a landing not far from the crest. Night came on, but sleep eluded them all. The constant rumbling, coupled with the rising and falling glow of the forge, grated at their nerves and worries. They each managed to choke down the water ration, but no one showed any interest in the jerky. Finally, Emmeline succumbed to exhaustion and curled up beneath the blankets, leaving Marsh alone with Samat in puma form. After a long period of silence, he stood and made his way back up the ridge, with the she-were padding silently beside him. Marsh cleared the crest and then kept walking until he found a flat rock some ways down toward the forge. When he sat upon the rock, a sparkle and shimmer announced Samat's shift back to human form. He felt her warmth against his back. Then her arms wrapped round him from behind, and lips nuzzled his neck. "So here we are," she said softly. Marsh nodded as he raised a hand to absently stroke her arms. "The memories are thick tonight." His voice seemed hollow, as if the night were swallowing all the feeling. Samat's arms tightened around him. "How so?" "I can see this plain as it was, green and filled with herds of bison. I can hear the laughter of the nomad children and smell their cook fires. And I can see her face now, Samat, as clearly as I can see that hellish forge. I see it full of life and joy, not twisted as it was in the end. I can see her playing games with nomad children, laughing. I know her name. It was Eve Banathor, and I can see her looking out of a bridal veil at me and smiling." Samat guided him down to lay his head in her lap. Her strong fingers stroked his hair and caressed his brow. He turned his head to look again at the forge. "I can remember that as well." "I know." The she-were's voice seemed strained, but Marsh did not want to remain silent. "Every single time." Yes. This time he heard the sniff and the crack in her voice. "I don't want to do this. I don't want you to either. But you will. A tear splashed on his cheek. He reached up to touch it. I don't have a choice, do I? He turned his head to look up at her, to see the glimmer in her black eyes. He raised his hand to her cheek and brushed the tears away. Samat pressed into his hand. Neither of us ever has, my mate. She turned her head to kiss his hand. Then Samat stretched out beside him, and one last time the memories faded for a bit. In the morning, Marsh and Emmeline stashed all the remaining spring stim in their normal travel gear with the exception of the canteen in a small gully close to their last campsite. Once their non-essential gear was stowed, Emmeline helped him don his armour. As they finished their preparations, Samat came trotting back over the ridge and transformed. The path is clear, she announced in a self-satisfied tone. No hellspawn remain alive outside the forge. Having had her say, she transformed back into a puma and ran back over the ridge. I guess that's it, then, Marsh said with a sigh. Emmeline nodded and then slung the canteen strap over her head and packed up her spear. He turned to follow Samat and never looked back. The trail to the forge had once been a paved road of the Empire. Some of the cobbles were still visible where the wind had cleared away the sand. In any event, the path was smooth and level, and they made good time the whole day. By mid-afternoon, they stood at the bottom of the steps that led to the Dark Lady's entrance. I feel sick, Emmeline said miserably. It's the magic, noted Marsh with a nod. The forge taints it. I've been wanting to throw up for 3 days now. Why raise a mountain in the middle of a plain? The woman was truly mad. He glanced back at the girl. She may have been mad, but she was still clever as a fox. By raising the forge here, she could control the environment. The mountains run with older powers, deep and secret. Here in the plains, she had hold of the reins. He looked back at the forge. Not that it helped her a damn in the end. He began walking up the steps. Memories swarmed about him as Samat matched his steps with her predator grace. 500 steps to the landing, 1,000 paces into the heart of the mountain. Emmeline closed up behind him as they reached the portico. The she-were stepped forward a few paces, and Marsh drew his sword. We have to be careful from here on, he warned the girl. God alone knows what's been summoned inside. With that, he motioned the she-were to continue inward as he and Emmeline followed close behind. Inside the tunnel, Marsh soon spied the signs of others. Footprints in the dust led inward ahead of them. Sconces filled with mage fire lit the way. 300 paces in, he spied a group of odd shapes. They spread out as best they could to approach their low forms on the floor of the passage. Marsh reached out with his sword and flipped back a cloak. Emmeline took one glance and then began vomiting up her last water ration on the side of the tunnel. Samat padded over to sniff and offered a low growl. Marsh shook his head. Dogran mages and their guards. Not sure they intended to become human sacrifice to stoke the lady's forge, but they did. Sloppy and wasteful. But no sign of the summoner. Odd. 7 corpses filled the hallway, all horribly burned. The feel of sickened magic lingered. Marsh leaned forward to pull a battered shield free from the grip of its last owner. Oh, now I don't feel as exposed, he said as Emmeline appeared at his shoulder, wiping her mouth with the back of her sleeve. Marsh gave her a wink. Shall we see who is at the end of this tunnel? The girl nodded without speaking, but she did not look down. They had almost reached the end of the tunnel when Samat snarled without warning and leapt forward. An unearthly scream filled the tunnel as Marsh and Emmeline bunched together in a defensive stance. Hellspawn charged out at them from the glowing chamber beyond. The 3 beasts' massive forms filled the tunnel from side to side. Ram's horns topped what should have been their heads, and massive goat's feet supported their bulk. In between, a swollen parody of a man's torso supported a pair of monstrous arms tipped with clawed hands that flexed as they charged. The creatures had no faces, only whirling shadows with burning red lights for eyes. Emmeline screamed, but she also thrust her spear out at the head of the nearest horror. The construct's howl of agony deafened Marsh as he raised his shield to fend off a blow from the left while stabbing at the centre demon. When his target jumped back to avoid his sword, he caught a glance of the girl's spear coming back, the enchanted dagger glowing crimson. A solid blow cracked the shield and dropped him to his knee. The centre monster rushed back, eager to take advantage of his stumble. He stabbed upward at its groin, and was rewarded with another bellow as the sword bit deep. Amelin's spear flashed out again, cutting the sound short. The last of the hellspawn kicked out and lifted Marsh into the air. His armor absorbed the blow, but it still knocked the wind from his lungs. Amelin's answering cry was one of battle, not fear, as she rammed her weapon forward into the demon's belly. Before the beast could react, Samat landed upon its back and slashed her claws across its throat. The she-were leapt away as the beast collapsed in a heap on the floor, then turned to glare at the carnage. Marsh gasped in air as best he could. Amelin stepped from demon to demon, stabbing her spear down to make certain of their kills. "Well," Marsh finally managed to say as he stood, "time to meet their master." He dropped the cracked shield and picked up his sword before walking down the tunnel. Samat shifted to human form and joined him, and Amelin brought up the rear. Stepping out of the tunnel into the heart of the forge itself left them all speechless for a moment. A long walkway led to a raised dais on a pedestal in the center of the room. The edges of the path and pedestal fell away steeply to a glowing red chasm below. Crimson and orange lights swirled about the room, centered on an unmoving figure standing on the dais with its arms upraised. The stench of brimstone permeated everything. Marsh shook his head and then strode down the path. When he neared the figure on the bridge, he could see that the hands were desiccated and dead. He stepped round to the front of the husk and looked into its dried and lifeless eye sockets. "This is it?" he asked in wonder. "All those people dead? All that heartache and ruin for this? Just so you could call up a score of hellspawn and a single company of hob?" He spat on the upright corpse. "You weren't even worthy to be her footstool." His sword slashed out. The husk of the nameless mage, who sought the Dark Lady's power for himself, split in half and tumbled off the dais into the chasm below. "Idiot," muttered Marsh while needlessly wiping the sword and sheathing it. He looked up and saw that Samat had restrained Amelin from following him to the dais. He raised his hand to his lips and blew a kiss to the pair. He could see the confusion in Amelin's eyes and the resigned set of the she-were's jaw. The flowing colours of red and orange spun faster and faster about him. He watched them coalesce with a distant fascination, then removed his baldric and laid the sword on the dais. Images flashed through his mind as the lights took form before him, memories of green lawns and orchards, along with laughter and light. Eve's face appeared in the flames, twisted with rage. Her body congealed in stages thereafter, shrouded in flaming cloth. Marsh smiled and reached out with magic-shrouded arms to hold her spirit tight. "Time to sleep again, beloved," he whispered. Then he bent his knees and pushed off the edge of the pillar into the abyss. "No!" Amelin screamed as Marsh fell. The appearance of the Dark Lady had terrified her, but she had never expected her friend to so blithely leap to his doom. She struggled against Samat's grip, but the she-were's strength was implacable. "Enough!" Samat snarled, and she gave Amelin a hard cuff to the head. Tears sprouted from Amelin's eyes in grief and pain as she sank to the stone floor. The she-were released her and darted down the path to the dais to retrieve Marsh's sword. The swirling lights had disappeared completely now, and only the dull red glow from beneath lit the room. "Time to go, cub," Samat told her as she lifted Amelin to her feet, "and running is best." They sprinted back the way they had come, leaping over the demon carcasses and ignoring the corpses of the sacrifices as they went. When they came into view of the entrance, Amelin could see that it was closing, moving to seal the Dark Lady's lair once more. Their final leg-burning sprint ended with a leap through the narrow gap in the stone to land in a heap with bruising force on the landing outside. For a moment, Amelin lay panting on the stone, glad to just be breathing the outside air. Then the vision of Marsh toppling to his death with a screaming ghost in tow came rushing back, and she began to sob. As tears smeared her face, a low rumble came from the sky above, and fat raindrops began to splash in the dust around them. "Fair one be praised," Samat shouted at the sky with arms upraised. "Now we won't have to chew that wretched spring stem on the way back." Amelin sat up and scrubbed at her face with the back of her hand. "Marsh is dead. Don't you care?" The she-were turned to face Amelin, her face grim. Of course I care. Her left hand slipped down to cover her bare stomach. More than you could know. But why? Amelin sobbed. Why did he just jump off like that? Because of a curse as old as the sin that built this place. Samat snarled, and then she spat in the dust. Marsh carried the spirit of the husband of Eve Banathor within him. I don't know all the wheres and whys of it, but she took the magic around her and twisted it to create this place, and in so doing unhinged her mind. Samat huffed, a lingering melancholy filling her voice. In the end, the Wexman and Fate sages of the Empire had no choice but to twist causality and magic to enchant Lev so that he could stop the madness of the Dark Lady as no one else could. By loving her. Samat knelt down beside the girl, and her face softened. On the way to her lair, Lev Banathor found some small comfort with the she-were who was my ancestor. From their coupling came both my clan and his family. Now I will bear those fruits again and renew both lines, even as Marsh renewed Lev's oath by carrying the spirit of the Dark Lady, Eve Banathor, back to the netherworld. But why am I here? Said Amelin with a miserable sniff. Samat lifted Marsh's sword and placed it in her hands. As the witness, you were bound to these events every bit as much as Marsh and I were. You will go back to the Imperial seat at Grimar, where I cannot go, and tell the tale as you have seen it. Her fingers strayed again to linger above her womb, and you will let them know that the chain binding the Dark Lady remains unbroken. The end. Copyright 2005, 2026 by Darwin A. Garrison. All rights reserved. Author's Notes, January 30th, 2026. Hellforge was first published in 2005 in an e-book anthology pulled together by Lizette Gifford entitled Illuminated Manuscripts, ISBN number 1-55404-287-9. I present it here mostly as it was published, with only the most minimal of sprucing up. The tragedy of e-books remains that once a publisher shuts down, the only copies are those remaining in file folders or readers. There are no copies lingering in libraries waiting to be discovered by curious fingers in the future. So consider this my way of making this tale continue on, if only for a little while longer. This was my first sale, not technically pro by the rules of the time, but an actual sale nonetheless, where money changed hands for publishing rights. Even better, Lizette chose to use it as the lead story of 10, which was humbling for a neophyte like myself. In any event, at some point, an idea came to me where the adventures of Samat and Amelin could continue in novel form. There was more to the world than I had originally imagined, and I wanted to bring it to life. Thus, Hellforge became the kernel concept for my novel project Rogue Destiny, which I am currently working my way through. My first story will, in all likelihood, directly lead to my first completed novel. And that is an oddly bittersweet irony. This is Lord Rexworth. We hope you enjoyed this production of Hellforge by Darwin A. Garrison. If you enjoyed this narration, you'll be happy to know that Lord Rexworth also streams on Twitch, Kick, Rumble, and YouTube. All links can be found at lordrexworth.com. Please feel free to visit, follow, and subscribe. We look forward to seeing you there. AI theme music created by Sibi using Suno. Thank you for listening to this Darwin's Evolutions Publishing production. This recording is copyright 2026 by Darwin's Evolutions Publishing. All rights reserved.